Berserk. Well then, Berserk. Hi, I'm Reed, this is Crowline Publishing, and today we are returning to our ongoing series about taking existing media properties, novels, computer games, movies, TV shows, whatever, and how we can adapt and steal and take from them for our own ttrpg games. And today we're going to talk about the very famous Japanese comic and transmedia property, Berserk. Widely considered one of the most artistically powerful manga ever made, Berserk really is as good as what they say. The art is incredible, the storyline is compelling, the characters do not have to be this deep for a dark, violent fantasy. And now it's often called grimdark. That is a kind of new school fantasy genre that emphasizes brutality and violence and suffering, but I don't think that's quite right. I think that Berserk is just straight up a horror fantasy. Now, I'm just going to have to say, before we begin, you might have heard about this, so you can turn the video off now. When I say horror fantasy, I'm not fooling. Bad things happen to good people in Berserk all the time. There is some horrific violence, and yes, you've probably heard about this. There is some sexual violence. It is often depicted in terms of quite, extreme horror. If that's a deal breaker for you, no matter how beautiful the art or amazing the world, you just won't get into it. And I've got to admit, more than once I've watched the cartoon and just fast forwarded through some bits. It's like that. I'm a bit sensitive to that sort of stuff, but, also I can contextualize it, and I think that you'll be able to as well. And I think that you should give it a go, because Berserk has a lot to teach us about DMing. It's a fantastic example of minimalist world building, and so I hope that you do, or can, engage with Berserk somehow. Anyway, on with this video. Now, Berserk takes place in Midland, and it's pretty clearly 15th century stuff. And in fact, Guts, the main character, is named after a real-life knight called Guts. So the aesthetic is knights and barding and peasants' armies, and with firearms are just starting to be introduced. We see cannons, but we don't tend to see very much guns. And Guts will eventually get a gun himself, but he also uses a repeating crossbow quite a lot. There's a church, and the church is very politically powerful. It's called the Holy See. It has church knights, and in D&D terms we can talk about there's paladins here, there's wizards, there's witches, there's elves, there's hedge magicians. If you want to see an ideal world as written for a D&D game, as in a D&D game that you don't have to modify, you do much worse than Berserk. This feels really like, I think, the aesthetic that D&D does better than anything else. That it's sort of its baseline expression of fantasy is going to match up really strongly with Berserk. So our protagonist Guts, he's born into poverty. He is sold to a man who sexually abuses him, and then he grows up to be a big, huge lad who obviously has a lot of anger management problems. He's a barbarian, by the way, for sure. But I think we need to just pause there for a moment. Immediately, Guts is not just a brute. He's not just a maniac. He is a man who is acting out of profound trauma. And that is never ever forgotten throughout the series. He is a man who has been victimized, and this is how he responds to it: violence and using a giant big bloody sword on people. Now, because he's a violent bastard, he impresses the mercenary company at the Band of the Hawk, and there he meets a man called Griffith, the master of the company, and his polar opposite, where Guts is big, gruff, tough, laconic, insane. Griffith is effeminate. He's beautiful. He's deeply civilized. He's loved for his generosity. He has huge charisma. And Guts also falls in love with the girl in the mercenary company, Casca. But Casca only has eyes for Griffith. And slowly but surely, supernatural elements are introduced. Griffith has a magical talisman called a Bailet that talks, which eventually we realize is a gift from hell itself. And then eventually, in their mercenary duties, they run across a human Minotaur man who's done a deal with hell. And that is Zed, and Zed is an apostle. Apostles are kind of the recurring bad guys of Berserk, and they are, I think, one of the best ideas that you will ever come across for a recurring D&D villain. I've had to actually cut out me raving about the God Hand and talking about Gnosticism for a long time. I think they are some of the most remarkable bad guys in fantasy literature. But the idea is that essentially they are humans who have made a direct deal with the devil, with the idea of evil is what it's called. In Berserk, there is very little evil that does not originate in the human mind and the human heart. But when I talk about the devil, I'm talking about this notion called the idea of evil. And certain humans who have a terrible fate, who have terrible sins that they've committed or committed against them, are invited to join the God Hand, who are these horrific Cenobite-style monstrous demon lords. And Griffith is on their hit list. They want Griffith to join them. And so they manipulate him into getting horribly tortured, horribly maimed. His beautiful, once magnificent form is just ruined and wrecked. And he joins them. It's one of the most incredible scenes I've ever seen, by the way, when he finally joins and finally becomes one of the God Hand. So it becomes apparent that Hell has designs on Midland, nihilistic plans that reek of contempt for humanity. Guts finds magical armor and a sword. It's one of the best designs you'll ever find. It's like super heavy metal. It's incredible. He eventually becomes friends with the Skull Knight, who's sort of a cool medieval ghost rider. And this is where the aesthetics begin to really ramp up to album cover fantasy here. This is really Blood and Thunder stuff. Not always, but the elements are there. Berserk is really a setting where you should feel free to take the imagery of the actual comic and show your players it looks like this. Even if you're not setting a game in Midland itself, showing off a monster or armor will bring home that Dark Souls, morbid goth vibe that Berserk does really, really well and that I personally love. Now after the Eclipse, which is what we call Griffith's transformation and his recasting as the main big bad of the entire series, the supernatural starts to increase. We meet more monsters, we meet fairies, we meet the pseudo-apostles, we meet more and more apostles, we explore cosmologies and we learn more and more about the agendas of Hell. And I think that this is really quite fascinating for a DM to study and for people who play ttrpgs to study, because this is what getting higher in level looks like to your characters. This is what the PCs experience. Guts starts out first level barbarian. Very little armor, big ass sword, but by the time we get to this period of the narrative, he's taken a few levels in Paladin, he's learned how to use a plate mail armor, and more importantly, he's understanding and navigating these much more complicated challenges and dealing with the agendas of Hell itself. So what else can we take from Berserk? Firstly, it's a really good look at what a historically inspired fantasy looks like. The Midlands themselves are very clearly based on politics and fashion and architecture that is supposed to be the Holy Roman Empire, which is in modern day Germany. And so for that alone, you should really go and just have a look at how the architecture is drawn, how the costumes look, how the hair looks, things like that. These are fantastic versions of historical examples. And I think the Berserk has some of the most interesting takes on magic and magic items especially. Guts' famous Berserker armor slowly threatens his sanity. I mean, it looks really, really cool, but he's slowly driving him insane, and there's very strong hints that it will eventually kill him. More importantly than all of that, it causes a dark beast, a representation of his PTSD and rage, to sometimes manifest. His sword, the mighty Dragon Slayer sword, is a dark thing and it's wild. It upsets sensitive people. And that's because it's been used on apostles and monsters. It isn't intelligent or alive as a D&D intelligent sword is, but it's upsetting to be around. It's aspected wrong. There's just something about it that just people hate. Later on, Guts and his friends help some elves out, help some fairies out, and they get given magical items and they become badasses. Having magical weapons is a big deal in the Berserk world. So for DMs looking to do more than just it's a +3 mace, read Berserk, because there's really, really strong takes on what magical items would look like, especially to people that aren't around magic. And Berserk is, for all the demons and stuff, a pretty low fantasy world. And then there's the Apostles. Let's come back to the Apostles, because they're just the best bad guys. They're the main villain type in Berserk. And very quickly, they're humans who have sold their soul for a monstrously powerful body and magical powers, but they're more than just devil cultists or mutants. I mean, in game terms, you can call them warlocks or clerics or paladins, but it's so much richer than that. Apostles are chosen by the God Hand to represent the worst of human depravity. These forces of evil are interested in human evil. They're interested in seeing just how bad we are, and so these apostles are tempted into sin because of their moral failings. A man who resents women for not liking him might become a kind of pig-themed horror monster. A coward and a sulk might become a shadowy assassin beast. And of course, they retain their human bodies. They have two forms they can swap between, but often their human forms are marked by their sins. Apostles are human ambition, human evil, taken to extremes and indulged by the God Hand utterly, who want to see what is inside the heart of humans. And that core psychological reality is what makes him such a strong bad guy. DMs, if when you're planning out a campaign and you're planning on stealing an apostle, build an apostle that reflects the theme of the campaign. You will find that it just really empowers your game. It will really resonate with your players as well. And when you combine this kind of strong thematic with the remarkable fantasy Hellraiser visuals and the emphasis on bodily horror, and of course the psychological wrongness that's inside the body, you will have a remarkable bad guy if you steal basically the idea of apostles. I love them. But all this talk of psychological aberrancy and the gothic impulses and bodily trauma and all the rest of it tells us that there's a lot that you can learn from Berserk about the nature of grimdark and about the nature of horror fantasy, because yes, it is a dark and a violent and horrific series, but it is also surprisingly philosophical. It doesn't need to be this. Guts isn't just a brooding loader. I mean, you'd like Guts if he was a 6'5" giant bastard maniac who just punched things in the face all goddamn day. But Guts is more than that. Guts is disturbed by the universe. He has been hurt and hurt and hurt by cruelty done to him, by cruelty done to the people that he loves. And also, he has a bad temper. He makes mistakes. He acts off impulse, and he regrets sometimes the terrible things that he does. He is all about responding to his own weakness, and he's all about responding to the predatory impulses of other people. Griffith isn't just a 20th level evil warlock. He is a man who is responding to his own horrific trauma, and he is a man who has begun to understand that maybe he was not the charismatic beauty that he always thought he was, and maybe he was much crueler than he ever suspected. And the god hand he serves is interested in seeing how humans respond to evil. Underneath all of Berserk is this notion of, I want to understand why bad things happen. And the secret to really effective grimdark fantasy is, yes, violence and sadness happens, and no, happy endings are unlikely, and sometimes the bad guys win, and that's all fine and good. But the real goal of grimdark and horror fantasy isn't to horrify or sicken your players with making them drink liquefied orphans or whatever. It is to make them reflect on sadness and cruelty. Let them fight off the orphan punching dick trolls, do whatever you need. But then ask them a simple thing when they've encountered the horrors of grimdark, when they've encountered brutality and violence. This is a good GMing trick now. Ask your characters how they feel about it. How does your character feel? It is such a simple technique, but it works really, really well. How does your character feel? And finally, the monsters in Berserk are really, really cool. If you ever want to ramp up the horror elements of a fantasy campaign, or even an alien-heavy SF game, have a look at Berserk. Show off the Sea God, which is a particularly fantastic version of a Lovecraftian beastie. The dragons look sick, and creating that aesthetic of darkness and horror and heavy metal brooding thunder. Come to Berserk. Now I'm going to leave it there, but with one final note of warning, and it's about the tone of Berserk, and it's about the tone of grimdark fantasy. In general, everyone's levels are different, alright? Do not start out trying to gross people out. Do not start trying to shock people or, make them confront the horrors of the world. It doesn't feel great to upset someone, and everyone's levels are different, and it's surprisingly easy to do because you never know what's hiding behind people's eyes. You never know what their experiences are. And an RPG is not a novel. It is not a comic. There is much less mediation between you reading about a character and you pretending to be that character. And players can feel very, very close to not only their PC, but to the other PCs around the table. And so torturing them, humiliating them, let alone, the more horrific sexual elements of Berserk. I mean, okay, look, I do not think that there's anything that is banned forever from RPGs. I think that anything theoretically can be appropriate for the gaming table. But are you really going to take a big risk at genuinely upsetting people and genuinely upsetting their feelings for what? No, don't do that. But cautious warnings aside, I highly, 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 highly recommend Berserk, as I recommend giving me a like, a share, and a subscribe. And even if you're worried about some of the violent stuff and some of the gross stuff, you're an adult, you can always skip a page or fast forward a scene. The comic Berserk is remarkably beautiful, has a brilliant dark fantasy aesthetic that anyone who's a fan of this material will absolutely love. The anime is pretty fun. There's 2 different versions of it, but neither of them really nail the dark aesthetic. At least go and have a look at the Eclipse scene. It's on YouTube, you can find it, it's very easy. Berserk's use of D&D tropes, its essential intelligence, but also its willingness just to be sometimes a kick-ass, stomping adventure story really elevates it to something special and something that we can steal from. I'm Reed, this is Crowline Publishing. Go on, give us a thumbs up. I love you. Bye-bye.